Let's go ahead and get started. Thank you guys so much for being here and joining me this afternoon, and thanks for everybody at Droidcon for having me here too. It's a delight to come here and speak to you guys. My name's Bill Phillips, and I work at a company called Big Nerd Ranch. And at Big Nerd Ranch, we do two things. We write applications as a consultancy, and we also train people. As part of training, we happen to do a lot of writing, and a big part of that writing is writing books as well. So if you know us, you might know us by our guide. A lot of the talks that I've seen here, I've seen a lot of wonderful talks in the past couple of days. My talk is a little different from the talks I've noticed. This talk is going to be a little bit more reflective. We're going to be talking a lot more about things that I would imagine you probably already know about technically, but I'm going to be talking about my perspective on that kind of stuff, because what I do is a lot on that training side, on the writing side. So our big thing that we do is we have a 5-day intensive boot camp where we take people who don't know anything about Android from square one all the way through being able to write Android applications, simple Android applications. So by the time you get to the end of the week, you've written 4 or 5 Android apps. And I expect that most of you folks probably don't need 5 days of learning the basics of Android. But that's what we do. That's where I'm coming from when I'm talking about this. And that's what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to be talking about fragments in that context. So needing to do that, if we're only going to have 5 days with people, we really need to be thinking about what's important for them to learn. What is really going to get them to actually writing useful applications that do useful things for real people. So if we're going to put something into this, it had better be useful to everyone. We like to cover a lot of ground in those 5 days, and our most useful tool for doing that is this guy right here, our Big Nerd Ranch Guide to Android Programming. So kind of the history of this book is that we initially wrote course materials for our course, which is a series of exercises that we bring people through. And we polish it and work with an editor and make it really tight. And then we bring it out to the public with a book. So that's kind of the history of how the book came to exist. But if you buy this book out at a bookstore or something like that, or Amazon, you're really seeing our power tool, our hammer in this class that we use to cover all this ground quickly. And just speaking from my own personal experience, I didn't expect to be in the position of ever writing a book or working on a book. And it was an interesting experience, and it really changes your perspective on things to do something like that. One of those things that it changes is your attitude towards APIs that we learn and the things that we need to know to actually do the work of programming. It's kind of like having a large code base in a certain sense, in that whenever you see something new and exciting and shiny, while you can be excited about it being new and exciting and shiny, you also think to yourself, is this really going to be worth the investment? Because I'm always thinking about that 5 days. Is this going to be worth adding to this, moving something out and including that? So if we can conserve our students' mind space and go without some tool, that's a great thing. We talk a lot about restrictions of CPU and memory, but probably the biggest restriction that we run into in practical everyday programming is just how much we can think about, how much complexity we can understand and explain to somebody else. So many of the things that we explain in the class are going to be obvious, and certainly obvious to all of us, but fundamentals like what you need to understand what's going on with the most basic Android code that I could possibly run. So if I had a simple activity with one onCreate method, that's about the smallest amount of Android I can have. But even with that, I need to understand what an activity is. I need to understand what a lifecycle method is, what that bundle is doing, saved instance state, layout files. These undergird everything else that we do in Android. So they're fundamentals. We're not giving them up, of course. We're going to teach them to everybody. Other stuff I want to put in the course is stuff that does cool, exciting, new things for my application. So these are all examples from our book, which I took just because they happen to be handy to me. But on the left, this is our exercise that does animation. So animation is one thing that I would be really excited about teaching people about, because that lets them achieve something they couldn't do before. The middle one is an exercise on touch events. I have no problem. I love teaching people about touch events because that enables you to do something new and cool in your application. Same thing goes with maps. So all of these things are like the meat. I love getting to this stuff. I love having students work through it. So where do fragments fit into this? So this is our basic fragment, and if we think about it from the standpoint of somebody who's looking to write a brand new screen or controller, a fragment, I can do pretty much the same thing that I can in an activity as far as what I can accomplish, or so it seems. So to a beginner, when I start introducing this idea and talking about what the fragment does, their first question is like, who cares? Who needs to know about this? And I need to answer that question too. If I don't need to have fragments, then let's leave them out. I would prefer not teaching something if it's not useful. So why bother with it? So to answer this question, I'm going to kind of review aspects of the fragment. And let's kind of think about that stuff from the perspective of somebody who's new to this. I want to note, by the way, that since I am kind of making a case here, that we're going to be seeing a lot of stuff that's new, that's familiar to us. Now, first I want to talk about the kind of drawbacks of the fragment that I see. And this is going to be a short list of drawbacks, but the first one would be if we talk about the life cycle. So our activity, of course, has a life cycle. This is a simplified version of the activity life cycle diagram, but this is kind of how I tend to think about it in practice, that I've got, non-existent, stopped, paused, and running. Sometimes I'll think about on the side this sort of stash state where saved instance state is the only representation of my activity. But this is kind of how I think about things. If we compare that to the fragment life cycle, that looks immediately more complicated, right? I've got 4 more states that are sitting in there. But on top of that, it's no longer perfectly straightforward, is it? I've got this diagram sorry, not diagram. I've obviously got a diagram, but I've got this diamond here, which signifies whether my fragment has been retained or not. Now, I generally frown on retained fragments, but they're out there. They're a possible part of the fragment lifecycle, and they change how I go through this state diagram. So this is a lot more complex than what we had before. You've also got problems with additional state that is not indicated on this diagram, functional state relating to the fragment. So let's think about its relationships to the activity and to its view. Sometimes my fragment has a view and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes my fragment is attached to an activity, sometimes it's not. You need to know where you are in the life cycle to know about these things. The activity doesn't have these problems. As soon as I create my activity, I've got a view. I've got it all the time. I don't have to worry about it. I don't have to check about this stuff. So that's just the life cycle part of the fragment. What about other ways that it might be complicated? Just in our most basic fragment hosting code, we can kind of see some more additional complication for somebody who's new to this stuff, right? Which this, again, this is basic fragment stuff, but if I look at this, I immediately have this question of like, and I have to answer this question, why am I having a transaction here if I'm adding my fragment to my activity? Why can't I just add the thing? And the answer, of course, is that sometimes we want to have multiple fragment modifications at the same time. Sometimes we want to roll back modifications to the state of the fragments in my activity, and that's kind of why we have transactions. But I've also got this if saved instance state is equal to null, which, again, if we're looking at it from somebody who is naive and doesn't understand anything about this, I look at that and I go, what the heck is going on? What does that have to do with this? We as experienced Android developers know that if you see saved instance state is equal to null, that's a giveaway that something is saving stuff out to saved instance state. And that's, of course, what's happening here. Fragment Manager is saving out the state of what fragments are associated with which positions in the layout to that saved instance state. But that's non-trivial. That's a little complicated. So by covering all that stuff, I simply wanted to establish that fragments are non-trivial. They're not something that I'm going to cover in just one quick chapter and say, oh, here's how fragments work. You're all done. Let's move on. I would have to have some sort of significant commitment to it. So what about the flip side? What do fragments help us out with? Well, the first thing I bring up to people in my lecture is I talk about the classic problem of tablet versus phone. So let's say I had an application that had your classic master detail situation. I've got a list of things. I tap on them, and I have a detail activity that maybe shows a little dude waving his hand. I don't know why I draw that every time, but I do. And that's what I have. Now, what happens if I, at some point in the future in my application, want to adapt this to work in a tablet situation? Well, now I've got a problem because I would have to find some way to duplicate or share this code across both of these sets of controllers. And out of the box in Android prior to Fragments, there wasn't really a nice way to do that. So the way that Fragments solve this problem is to, instead of having two activities that have the whole user interface inside of them, I have two activities that have holes inside of them. And inside of the holes, I host these magic things called fragments, and I put all of my user interface inside the fragment instead of inside the activity. Now, when I want to create my tablet version of the activity, I just create an activity that has two different holes in it and host the two fragments in it. Pretty cool. So that's one example of a problem I solved with fragments. Another one would be ViewPager. Out of the box, ViewPager is really the easiest way to use ViewPager is to use it with fragments. You can, if you know how to, or if you have a library that does it or something, make a ViewPager pager adapter that uses straight up views. But if you already have your code in a fragment, all you have to do is create a fragment pager adapter or a fragment state pager adapter and host it in this guy, and all of a sudden you're off to the races. It's a really handy component to achieve this effect. And then the last example I have is dialogues. Raise your hand. Who here, does anybody remember what working with dialogues was like before Fragments? Anybody work on those? Yeah, not great, right? So with the new dialogue API, it's based on this idea of the dialogue fragment, which is kind of based on the insight that, oh, once I have my code hosted in a fragment, my fragment already knows how to recreate itself after rotation. So even if my dialogue dies when my activity is destroyed, when the fragment is rehosted, all I have to do is redisplay the dialogue and I'm golden. So that's my quick and easy brief case for why fragments are something that would be worth teaching. Now me at this point, thinking about this argument, I go, I guess that means that they should be somewhere in the week. Maybe I can kind of shove them off towards the end of the book or something. They do seem a little complicated, but I'd rather not talk about them if I have to. Kind of keep them in kind of this back burner area. But unfortunately, there's something that comes along with this that keeps me from having them in a back burner area, which is that for each of the situations I've just described, they are really the only non-deprecated way in the standard API of accomplishing these kinds of things. There are ways that people are talking about doing them outside of the standard Android APIs, but we're kind of stuck with them. So now I'm kind of gone from, you know, should I include fragments, kind of leaning against it because they're a little complicated, to then seeing, okay, I've got these things that fragments actually do. They are kind of useful. Maybe I should keep them in there. And now I'm at this place of, oh, actually, they're critical. Everybody needs to know about them, at least in some situations, to use them in these scenarios. I need to teach every student this stuff. So, when I think about this, another question pops into my head, which is this. To do some things, it helps to have a lot of code in a fragment. So I've got a question I'm kind of building up to, but the points I want to make first are, first, it does help for these tasks I just described to have your code in a fragment. Next, I can also write the same kind of code in either an activity or a fragment. There's some things that if I write my code in an activity, it's going to make things hard, or I can write it in a fragment and it makes these other things I would want to do a little easier. So here's the question. The question is, why should I use an activity? Why should I use a fragment? When should I use these? This is a question that people ask me. They're starting to write a brand new application. They're starting to write new controllers. Which one should I choose? And I have a little bug in my head when I think about this question that gets a little annoyed. Because again, we're talking about this 5 days highway of, I want to go from here to doing useful things. And one of the things that I think about in that context is, am I making useful decisions on this way? Am I introducing unnecessary complexity? And I think about this question, and I'm like, is this really a meaningful question? Do I really care? If I am starting to write some screen, you know, am I going to put it in a fragment because I think maybe in the future I might need to have it in a tablet interface? Am I going to know that I'm going to have a tablet interface when I first write a screen? Probably not. I don't know what the lifetime of my code is going to be. I don't know what's going to happen to it. So yeah, because of this, my answer to that question is, well, since that's not a meaningful choice to me, I'm going to recommend, if somebody's asking that question, I'm going to say default to using a fragment. I can do everything with a fragment that I can do from an activity. So why not just default to using this thing? So now we've gone even further down this road. I started off really skeptical. You know, this is a fragment. It's kind of complicated. I don't know if I want to deal with it. To, I see that it can do some things. And then to, okay, I see it does some critical things. I'm going to have to teach people about it. And then finally to, this is what I should recommend as a default best practice. I found that to be a kind of surprising place to be. That thought process was something I went through, what, 2 or so years ago when we were working on the first edition of the book. I actually think it's like 3 years ago now. And at that time, we had to make the not fun decision to go through and rewrite all of our exercises and all of our explanations. And we went through 2 or 3 revisions of the beginning of this material, the beginning of this book, where we talk about, you know, the most important part of it, which is how you use Android Studio, how you get your first activity on the screen, how you use a layout, that kind of stuff. We started having to integrate fragments into talking about that stuff. It wasn't a lot of fun, but we felt there was a need for it. Now, things are a little different now than they were then. Back when we first made that decision, it was a little adventurous. And now we have a lot of folks in the community who don't necessarily agree that fragments are a great idea. They're not new and shiny and fancy, and folks have some experience under their belt, and some folks are saying, hey, we don't like fragments. They're causing problems for us. One of the things I've really liked about getting to go out to conferences, I've only just started doing this because I'm a really shy person. I don't know if anybody can relate here. But getting out to conferences has meant going out and talking to people who are doing other things that are different from what we do, which is great. If we're wrong about what we're recommending, I really want to know about that because I'm responsible for telling a lot of folks who read this book what I think the right way of doing things is. So some of the really negative consequences of fragments, I only really have a couple of ones that I really want to talk about that have come up since I was initially evaluating it. And the first one is illustrated by this code right here. So this code here, if you run it, if you say begin transaction and remove fragment and commit it inside of onStop, you're going to get an exception. The reason why you get an exception is, I mean, it's really surprising if you don't really understand fragments that deeply or the saved instance system that deeply, but once you understand those two, you can kind of put two and two together and realize, oh, after onStop, onSave instance state has already been called. So anything I try and change inside of onStop is going to get dropped on the floor. So that it's actually throwing an exception is a nice safeguard, even though I may be really annoyed when I run into it. So we can get around it by calling this commit allowing state loss method, which still strikes me as gross, and I know folks need to use it in practice oftentimes, but the need to use this method strikes me as just kind of, it doesn't speak well for the API sometimes. I'm like, ugh, that anybody needs to use this thing. And then the other one that I don't really have a slide for is just the issue of testing. I think that's been the biggest issue with fragments. And the reason that fragments are really problematic testing-wise is exactly the same reason that they're quick to use for a beginner, which is that they kind of sit at this knot of several different interests, you know, which is the need to preserve broad changes to screen state and the need to have reusable components for different parts of the screen. Each one of these they're kind of related to one another, and Fragments has kind of a solve-it-all kind of solution. It kind of does it all for you. But that makes testing these things a really big problem because they do not really abide by the principle of having one clear responsibility that I can test. So that's the situation. Now, what are the alternatives that, again, talking about my perspective here, what are the alternatives that I have when I'm thinking about dealing with this? Well, one alternative is that I could just do what I am doing right now and recommending fragments. And I think that's kind of always an option, simply because the world hasn't opened up and swallowed me and destroyed me for using fragments so far, so I suppose I can keep on doing it if I want to. So I guess that's an option that's on the table. Another option is to ditch fragments and talk more about custom views. And finally, the last option would be to replace fragments with some sort of library. So the second option, I don't think I can do. One, I can't really ditch fragments because of what I mentioned earlier with the different problems that they solve. Talking more about custom views would be a great thing, but I'm not really yet comfortable showing a beginner all of the code that I would need to write in a custom view to take care of all these situations. Or at least I'm not personally familiar enough with it yet. My feeling on that may change as I get to know the alternatives, but right now it's not something I feel like there are too many ins and outs and too much complexity and boilerplate involved in doing that. Another option would be to replace fragments with a library, and I don't think that's an option either. There are a couple of reasons for that, though. One being that when you're introducing beginners to the Android frameworks and Android as a whole, you kind of have to choose your battles and pick what you're going to explain. And one nice thing about our course and our book right now is that it's focused exclusively on the standard libraries. That really helps with the fact that it's a printed document that you might keep around or have on your desk to refer to or have for a while, because that has some permanence to it. It's like a street sign, right? And a lot of the libraries that we use are kind of more like a food truck. Maybe I don't want to have a street sign that points at a food truck that might be moving in 6 months or something like that. The other reason why I don't feel comfortable with replacing fragments with a library yet is that, unfortunately, the library solutions that I've seen are still pretty complicated. More complicated to explain to somebody who is new at this than fragments are, as complicated as fragments really are. And that's because you really have to have a couple of libraries that are trying to fix this. Because, again, that fragment is that kind of knot of multiple interests that it's trying to solve, I end up wanting to have two distinct tools that solve this problem too. So that's what we decided for the second edition of the book that we released earlier this year, which is that we're going to stick with our recommendation. This is still what we use in-house. We still use a fragment-oriented architecture for our consulting development, and we've had good success with it so far. But I do want to talk more about that decision number one from the standpoint of larger community, because I think that decision number one is really about choosing a base plate. So if anybody's played with Legos, you know that if you're building like a town or a space station base or something like that, you have some plate of Lego studs that you're putting your pieces on, that it's your base plate that you build on top of. Well, when we're programmers, we have the same thing too. If I start up an application, I have something that I put down first that I start building on top of, and that's our base plate. And that's what I really think of this fragment recommendation as. I'm thinking, get used to, when you go and make a new screen, create an activity and create a fragment inside of it, and make that mechanical, memorize it, make it rote. Once you get used to doing that, you'll set yourself to being more comfortable in the long run as far as what you can do with your code base and how you can reason about your code base. Because now I don't need to think when I'm going in there, it's like, oh, is this code going to be in a fragment or an activity? It's always in a fragment. I only need to ask that question. Now, what does this mean to the larger community is, I think, is another interesting thing, because this is what I think kind of the reason why people are kind of interested in this, is it's sort of, what common tools are we all using? What are we going to agree on? A lot of us don't like this base plate. A lot of us disagree with it. So I would like to talk briefly about sort of the politics of base plates and how they work. Well, you've got kind of two big, if I were to really simplify things, you've got two broad categories that base plates fit into. On the one hand, you've got ecosystems like Apple, Microsoft, Google fits into this category too. And this is where some large corporation has made the platform that you're building off of. And on the other side, well, actually, let me talk a little about this first. So this situation can be kind of nice. And it's because I don't need to argue or figure out what I'm going to use for that base plate. I just go to the documentation and the best practices from this, could be a corporation, could be a large open source project, or some other institution that is making and creating the tools that I am using. So it's nice that I have that certainty. But of course, the downside is that if they're doing things that I disagree with, or that I think are kind of terrible and awful, I'm kind of stuck with them. I can have some kind of workarounds, but because of that structure of the community, my workarounds are probably going to be whatever I can get away with by myself, not in concert with other people. On the flip side of it, you've got communities like the web development community and like the Rails community. And here, they also have a base plate, but for whatever reason, that base plate, that ground base plate that they have to build off of is either too small, or it could be that it simply doesn't satisfy their needs for whatever reason. So like, for example, the web base plate it satisfies the needs of displaying web pages on a browser, but because it has this community standards process, it can't move fast enough oftentimes for what developers need. So as a result, they have a lot of libraries, a lot of frameworks, and things move really quickly. They're really exciting. It's really, you know, sometimes I look at my colleagues who do this kind of work, and I'm kind of envious that they always have something new and cool to work on. Or like the earlier presentation, were any of you guys here for the unidirectional data flows presentation on Android? That is all stuff from that community over there, and it's because they're constantly trying new ideas and doing cool new things. Now, in the Android community, while we have one of these baseplates that is built by Google, it is kind of shifting a little in this direction. And the reasons for that are, like, I can speak to our experience in our class. We teach nothing but the standard libraries. Well, do I really want to load an image using nothing but the standard libraries? Probably not, you know? So we're always going to be using something like Picasso or Universal Image Loader or one of these tools. But even beyond little tactical things like that, what I think moves my baseplate even more in this direction is something like dependency injection. You know what I said about fragments, about how I don't want to, like when I'm going from 0 to working on some screen, I don't want to have to think about whether I'm doing an activity or a fragment. Same thing goes with an application. I don't really want to, like if I'm starting up a project that I don't know how big it's going to be, I'm going to include a dependency injector. I'm just going to do it, even though at that phase of the project it's really not that useful. And that's because that's part of my baseplate. That's part of how I think about working on an application. So the cool thing about moving to this middle zone is that it does mean that we're doing a lot more exciting, cool things. The community is building new, cool, awesome new tools, and we get to learn new, awesome stuff. But there's a danger that arises with that too, from the perspective of the beginners that we end up teaching. And that is that the danger is that while you may end up with, you could end up with a circumstance where you make an ecosystem that is wonderful for all of us here in this room, because each individual problem that we have collectively had, we have come up with a tool and a solution that solves that problem for us. But if you think about our point A to point B of the highway of getting to a running application that does what we want, we're kind of meandering around and solving these individual problems to get here. Now, from the standpoint of somebody who is new to this and who doesn't know anything about all of that, that's going to look like, why am I going all the way around here? Why, like dependency injector? I can't. I've given my best shot at explaining dependency injectors to folks who aren't already sold on them. It's really easy to sell dependency injectors on people who already know how they work and can use them. For folks who aren't familiar with them, it's really weird. So it's like they're looking at this and they're like, why am I bothering with all of this? This seems like, you know, it seems like it's useless. And it really is, in truth. It's really solving our plumbing problems that work us around this way, when really our priority is getting from point A to point B. So, I don't know, when I think about this problem, I think about how I used to think about Java. Because I know a lot of folks came to Android from Java. I did not. I took Java in school, and then I kind of jumped over to Android. And for the time that I was a practicing programmer between when I graduated school and when I started with Android, I kind of saw Java from the outside. And my attitude on it, you know, right or wrong, was that, you know, I don't really see the appeal of Java. It seems like there's so much code to type in, there's so much boilerplate to get things going. There are all these weird libraries that I don't even know what they're supposed to do. when I read the short description on their webpage of it, and even to integrate them seems like I have to have all this XML and all this other configuration. But at the same time, I knew that there had to be something there because people I respected and companies that I respected were taking this tool, Java, and moving mountains with it, really doing awesome, incredible stuff with it on the server side. And of course, the reason that they got that to that place is because it was every single step of tooling and framework solved an individual problem, and the community as a whole could solve great problems, but it went from something that you could get onboarded to really quickly to something that took quite a lot of investment to get into. And you know, maybe that's where we'll end up with in the Android community. Maybe that's something that'll happen. That's not good or bad, but it could certainly be the case. So I don't know what's going to happen with that. That's not really my area of expertise. I wanted to share this stuff mainly because it's something that I see, and I thought that it was something that other people might like to hear about. All I can say for sure is that there is only so much that anybody can learn in 1 week. And I think we often forget how much we already know in our practice as day-to-day programmers. So I thought I might share with you a different perspective on that stuff. If we're concerned about folks who are in that position who are learning Android for the first time, we should be making solutions that are respectful to their cognitive load as well as our own. Thanks. That's all I got. Anyone have any questions? I know it's not a super technical talk, but maybe somebody has an interesting question. All right, well, thank you guys very much. Once again, my name is Bill Phillips. I work for Big Nerd Ranch. If you guys need training or need to make an app, give us a call. That's what we do, and we love to do it. Thank you so much. Have a good one.